The wind howled through the streets of Redemption Ridge, Montana, biting at exposed skin, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter. The year was 1887, and as the sun sank behind the snow-capped mountains, the small town seemed to grow even colder. At the edge of Miller's Mercantile, Catherine Brennan stood alone, surrounded by her 6 children, each one huddled close to her like a small fortress of warmth in a world that had grown indifferent to their suffering. Catherine's eyes were bloodshot, her face pale from exhaustion, but it was the hollow-eyed stares of her children that cut deeper than the cold. The youngest, Sarah, only 4 years old, had stopped crying an hour ago, a silence that scared the townspeople more than any wail of desperation. When a child stops crying, it often means they've given up. It means they're close to dying. Catherine held out her trembling hands, counting the coins she had left over and over. She was short by $4.27, enough to buy just one more sack of flour, maybe a couple of pounds of dried meat, but not enough to make a difference. Her husband, Marcus, had died of pneumonia 3 months ago, leaving behind nothing but debts that had piled up faster than she could keep track of. The house they'd lived in was no longer theirs. The children's laughter had faded from the once cozy rooms. Now, they slept in an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town. It had been 2 weeks since the eviction, and every night, the winter wind crept in to steal the warmth they so desperately needed. The people in town had turned their backs. The shopkeeper, Mr. Miller, had refused to let them inside to warm up. No credit for widows. Cash only, he told her coldly when she'd asked for a few more days. The townspeople walked by, their eyes cast downward, as if pretending she didn't exist. No one offered help. No one even stopped to ask if they were all right. They had all but abandoned her family. Catherine's hands shook as she tried to make her few remaining coins stretch. Her mind raced with thoughts of where to go next. What to do? She couldn't stay in the barn. The children's health was already failing, but the town had nothing left to offer. Then a shadow fell over her, a large, imposing figure framed by the setting sun. James Cartwright, the rancher from Copper Creek, had arrived in town for his winter supplies. He was a man of few words, a figure of silence and solitude, known throughout the territory as a man who preferred to be alone. He'd lost his wife and child to illness years ago and had retreated into the mountains to live out his days in peace. At least, that's what the rumors said. James had no intention of getting involved in anyone's problems. He was here to buy flour, salt pork, and kerosene. Nothing more. But when he noticed the widow and her children standing outside the mercantile, something in him stirred. He tried to ignore them at first, but every time he glanced their way, he saw the desperation in their eyes. The youngest child, Sarah, had collapsed from hunger, and Catherine was cradling her, doing her best to comfort her in the cold. Her pride was as fierce as ever. She lifted her chin, refusing to beg, even as her body trembled from the weight of her circumstances. James remembered the last time he'd felt this kind of weight, when his wife, Sarah, had died. Her last words to him had been, "Don't let grief make you cruel, James. Promise me you'll stay human." He had buried that version of himself along with her 8 years ago. But now, watching Catherine struggle, he felt something crack open inside him. Maybe it wasn't too late to feel again. His boots crunched in the snow as he stepped closer, finally unable to look away. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough and low. "I have a ranch about 10 miles north of here. It's a large house, too empty for one man. I need help with cooking, cleaning, household management. Honest work for honest pay." Catherine's eyes narrowed, and she instinctively stepped back, shaking her head. "I don't accept charity, sir." James met her gaze steadily, his expression unreadable. "It's not charity," he said quietly. "Name's James Cartwright. It's employment. Room and board, a fair wage, and you'd have your own quarters, separate, private. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to survive the winter." Catherine studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception. She found none, only exhaustion, only a man who, like her, had seen too much loss. The wind howled louder, but for a moment, the world seemed to quiet around them. "Please," James added, his voice barely a whisper now, "come with me." Catherine stood frozen for a long time. Her children watched from behind her, eyes wide with fear and hope. The cold had already taken so much from them. How much more could they endure? Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Catherine spoke. "One season," she said, "will work, but that's all." James nodded. "One season. Fair enough." Without another word, he turned and began untying the wagon. The townspeople continued to watch from the edges of the street, whispering. The scandal of it all hung in the air like an unspoken accusation. But Catherine held her head high, ignoring their stares. She had no choice but to follow this man into the unknown, even if it meant leaving everything she had ever known behind. James helped her children into the wagon, his rough hands gentle as he guided them in. As the wagon rolled out of town, Catherine didn't look back. But the children did, one last time, watching the only town they had ever known disappear behind them. As the landscape of Redemption Ridge began to blur with the falling snow, Catherine held Sarah close, trying to keep the little girl warm. The temperature was dropping fast, and the cold cut right through her layers of wool and cotton. Her heart raced with uncertainty. She had no idea what lay ahead, no idea if this man's offer was truly as simple as it seemed. Had she just saved her children, or had she led them into a different kind of danger? As the wagon climbed the last hill, the sprawling valley of Copper Creek Ranch unfolded below them, bathed in the fading light of the winter afternoon. The house stood proudly in the center, a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney curling smoke into the cold air. Beyond the house, the barn and corral spread out, a welcome sign of life in the otherwise barren, snow-covered landscape. A creek, frozen now, wound its way through the property, its banks lined with tall, silent trees. The children's faces shifted as they looked down at the ranch, their eyes wide with the first hint of hope they had felt in months. For the first time since their father's death, they were looking at something more than cold and fear, something that resembled safety. Catherine, too, felt a lump rise in her throat. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also unfamiliar. The ranch, the house, the land, they were all foreign to her, and yet they were her only option now. She exhaled sharply, the cold air stinging her lungs. "It's beautiful," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. James, sitting at the front of the wagon, didn't reply right away. His face was set in its usual grim expression, eyes fixed straight ahead. Finally, after a long silence, he muttered, "It's empty. Maybe you and yours can fill it with something besides silence." The words stung in the quiet of the evening, but Catherine didn't react. The wagon began its slow descent into the valley, and the ranch came into full view. Lanterns flickered in the windows of the house, casting warm light that seemed to invite them in, if only for a moment of relief from the cold. As the wagon stopped outside, a tall, broad-shouldered man emerged from the barn, Jake, the ranch hand. He nodded respectfully to James, then turned to help unload the wagon. James didn't seem to have much to say to him, only offering brief instructions as he helped carry the supplies into the house. The children remained in the wagon, their faces pressed against the cold window, taking in the sight of the ranch. Catherine followed James into the house, her boots scraping against the icy ground, her breath visible in the cold air. The house was large, far more spacious than she had expected. The West Wing, as James called it, was entirely separate from the main living area. 3 bedrooms lined the walls, a small sitting room in the center, and a private entrance that led out to the side. There was a fire already crackling in the hearth, its warmth a welcome relief from the bitter cold. "This is yours now," James said, his voice rough. "If you need anything, you know where I am." Catherine nodded, but she wasn't sure how to feel. The house was warm, Yes, but it was also cold in its own way. It felt too still, too silent. She noticed the small details as she stepped inside. The cradle in the corner of one of the rooms, the tiny boots by the door, the old, faded toys on the shelves. She could feel James's gaze on her as she took it all in. These were Sarah's, he said, his voice low. My wife's rooms, for the children we planned to have. His words hung heavy in the air, and Catherine felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for him. She didn't know the pain of losing a child, but she understood the weight of grief that never quite goes away. She turned away from him, not sure what to say. I'm sorry, she finally whispered, her voice soft. James gave a tight nod, not saying anything more. It's been 8 years, he muttered, more to himself than to her. But sometimes it still feels like it was just yesterday. Catherine didn't press him any further. She understood the silence. They both had their own grief to carry. The children slowly began to explore the house, running their fingers along the furniture as if unsure whether it was real or some dream they might wake up from. Emma, the oldest, found a doll on one of the shelves, and her eyes met James's with a question in them. It's yours now, James said softly, his voice almost distant. He left them then, disappearing through the door, leaving Catherine with her children and her thoughts. She stood in the center of the room, her heart heavy with the weight of everything they had lost and everything they were about to face. That night, as they sat down to their first meal in the house, the silence between them was thick with uncertainty. The children had never seen a table so large, never eaten from such abundance. James sat at the head of the table, his posture stiff, as if unsure how to act now that they were all here. The food was simple: venison stew, cornbread, and canned vegetables. But to the children, it was a feast. They ate hungrily, their eyes wide, not speaking much as they tucked in. Catherine could tell they were all thinking the same thing. This was not what they had expected, but it was enough to keep them going for now. After a while, James cleared his throat and spoke, his voice low but firm. Here's the deal, he said, glancing around the table. You'll work for your room and board. You'll help around the house, cooking, cleaning, mending. The older ones will take care of the chores outside. I'll be working the ranch from dawn to dusk. We'll eat together at breakfast and supper. Sundays are rest days, but church is optional. I'm not asking you to stay forever. In spring, you're free to leave or stay. Catherine raised an eyebrow. And what do you want in return? She asked, her voice steady. I don't want anything you can't give, James said, his gaze locking with hers. This is a business arrangement. Nothing more. There was a pause, and then Catherine's voice softened. We earn our keep. We're not charity cases, and we'll work honestly. James nodded. Fair enough. For a moment, the conversation lulled, and the clinking of spoons against bowls filled the space between them. Then, just as the meal seemed to settle into its rhythm, a small voice broke the quiet. Mister, are you our new papa? Sarah asked, looking up at James with wide, innocent eyes. The room went silent. Catherine froze, unsure of how to respond. James's face went pale, his jaw tightening. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Excuse me, he muttered, walking out of the room. The door closed softly behind him. Catherine was left alone with her children, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. She gathered Sarah into her arms, trying to comfort her. No, sweetheart, she said softly, brushing Sarah's hair from her forehead. Mr. Cartwright is our employer. We're guests here, not family. The children exchanged glances, clearly unsure of what that meant. But Emma, ever the protector, helped clear the dishes in silence, her gaze flicking between her mother and the door where James had disappeared. Catherine realized, as she watched her children, that James's wounds were deeper than she had ever imagined. The loss of his wife and child had shaped him in ways she couldn't understand. But maybe, just maybe, in time, they could help heal each other's pain. Later, Catherine followed James to the barn, where he was tending to the horses in the quiet darkness. She stepped softly into the barn, the sound of her boots muffled by the hay. "I apologize," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's 4. She doesn't understand." James didn't turn around at first. When he did, his eyes were hard, but there was a vulnerability there too, one that caught her off guard. "Not her fault," he said, his voice thick. "I just haven't been called that. Haven't earned it." Catherine's heart twisted. "Haven't been called what?" "Papa," she asked gently. James let out a breath, his expression softening. "My son," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He lived 1 hour. Never heard him say anything. Never got to be anyone's father." Catherine's throat tightened, and she stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Truly." He looked at her, his gaze distant. "I'll do better tomorrow," he muttered. "Won't run off like a spooked horse." Catherine smiled faintly. "You didn't spook. You felt. That's human." For a moment, they stood in silence, breathing in the cool night air, just two broken people trying to make their way in a world that had already taken so much from them. Finally, Catherine spoke again. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you for giving us shelter. Whatever this is, we'll make it work." James nodded, his lips tight. "One season," he said quietly. "We'll see what happens." But as Catherine stood in the barn, watching James tend to the horses, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed some invisible line, that something more was happening between them than either of them were ready to admit, something that would change everything. As the night deepened and the wind howled outside, Catherine tucked her children into their warm beds for the first time in months, her heart heavy with both hope and fear. Was this the beginning of something new, or the last chapter in a life that had already been written? The first week at Copper Creek Ranch passed in a blur of hard work and quiet moments, the kind of work that seemed to drain the body but lift the spirit. Catherine had risen before dawn every day, stoking the fire in the hearth and preparing breakfast for the children before James set off to work. The ranch, though cold and unfamiliar, began to feel more like a home with each passing day. The children were quick to settle into their new roles. Emma taking charge of the cooking alongside Catherine, Thomas feeding the horses, Margaret gathering eggs from the coop, and the younger ones tidying up their rooms and playing together. Slowly, the house began to take shape again as Catherine cleaned away the dust that had settled over the years of abandonment and opened the heavy curtains to let the weak winter light pour in. The walls, once shrouded in silence, now echoed with the sounds of children's laughter, tentative at first, but growing in strength as the days wore on. It was still a little awkward at the dinner table, the weight of their shared history and unspoken thoughts hanging in the air. James sat at the head of the table, his posture stiff and formal, like a man who had long forgotten what it felt like to share a meal with others. Catherine, too, had her moments of discomfort, but she could see the subtle changes in him, the way he seemed to listen more intently when the children spoke, the way his eyes softened just a little when they laughed. Still, he withdrew each evening to the barn or his study, disappearing into the quiet spaces of the ranch, as if to escape the warmth of the family they were slowly becoming. There was a growing rhythm to their days, a quiet harmony that settled in between the cracks of their differences. Catherine would find him at the barn, late into the evening, fixing fences or feeding the horses, his rough hands steady even as his heart seemed to carry a lifetime of loss. She'd offer him a warm meal, and though he rarely spoke of his past, she saw it in the way his eyes would briefly cloud over when one of the children spoke of their own losses. James didn't want to be part of family. He had made that clear from the start. His offer to them had been a business arrangement, a temporary solution to their immediate need for shelter and warmth. Yet, with every passing day, he found himself drawn deeper into their lives, even as he fought to keep the distance that he had built around himself for so long. His connection to the children grew, too. He found himself teaching Thomas the proper way to care for the horses, a task that had once been second nature to him but now felt like a bridge to a past he had buried. The boy listened intently, eager for his approval, and James found himself smiling, something he hadn't done in years. There were small moments of connection that he had not anticipated, like when Emma asked him to help her fix the fence or when Margaret asked him about the stars. And for the first time in ages, he found himself talking about the things he once loved, like the quiet nights spent under the Montana sky. But there was something even more unexpected happening in those quiet moments, something that neither of them were ready to admit. Catherine had always been proud, never one to ask for help unless she had no other choice. But she found herself leaning on James in ways she hadn't expected. She wasn't sure if it was the ease with which he worked or the way he carried himself, but there was something in him that spoke to her, a silent understanding that ran deeper than words. It wasn't just his strength that drew her to him. It was the quiet way he respected her, the way he never made her feel like a burden. He treated her as an equal, even though she knew he saw the scars of her past, the weight of everything she had lost. They had their differences. She was a mother, fiercely protective of her children, and he was a man who had built walls around himself, unwilling to let anyone close. Yet, somehow, in their shared work and quiet moments, they began to see each other for who they were, not just as survivors of their own grief, but as two people who might just be able to help each other heal. Still, there were moments of tension, moments when the weight of their unspoken feelings felt too heavy to bear. One afternoon, as James worked alongside Thomas to repair the corral gate, the boy asked him to teach him how to rope. James hesitated, his hands tightening on the rope for a moment before he gave a soft laugh and nodded. "You got a good eye for this," he said, his voice rough but kind. "You're a natural, son." The word caught in Thomas's ears, and for a brief moment, the boy froze, his heart racing. He hadn't heard that word in so long, and when James said it, something in him stirred, a glimmer of hope, perhaps, or maybe the faintest flicker of what could be. "You're a good boy, Thomas," James continued, his voice quieter now, his gaze softening. "You've got the spirit of a true rancher." The boy beamed, a wide smile spreading across his face. He'd never felt such pride before, and though James hadn't said it outright, Thomas knew that he had just given him something more than a lesson on roping. He had given him a piece of himself, a fatherly approval that Thomas had longed for since his own father had passed away. That night, after dinner, Emma pulled Catherine aside, her voice low with a quiet urgency. "Do you think we'll stay past spring?" she asked, her eyes wide with hope. Catherine hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering toward the warmth of the fire. "We'll see, darling," she said, her voice soft but uncertain. "We'll see." But Emma's question lingered in her mind long after the children had gone to bed. The ranch had begun to feel like home, but was it truly? Would they be able to stay here long term, or would they once again be forced to leave? Catherine didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing. They were no longer just surviving. They were living in the truest sense of the word, and that was more than she had hoped for when they had first arrived. As the days passed, life at Copper Creek Ranch became more than just a series of chores and tasks. It became a rhythm, a routine that brought comfort in its simplicity. Catherine noticed the small changes in herself, too. She had always been a woman who took care of others, but now she was beginning to take care of herself again. There was time for rest, time to reflect, time to breathe. She had never imagined that a place so cold and isolated could bring her this much peace. The children were thriving, each of them growing stronger in body and spirit. Even Sarah, who had been so frail when they first arrived, was laughing again, her energy renewed by the love and attention she was receiving. Margaret had begun to read books she found in the study, and Daniel spent his afternoons drawing pictures of the ranch. They were beginning to fill the house with life in ways Catherine hadn't thought possible. Yet, with all the small moments of joy, there were still the quiet times when the weight of the past pressed heavily on James. He would disappear for hours, often retreating to the barn or his study, his mind clearly preoccupied with something he didn't want to face. Catherine didn't push him, but she couldn't help but wonder if he was as haunted by his past as she was. The nights were the hardest for him, she knew. As much as the house was filled with life during the day, there was always an emptiness when the night fell, an emptiness that neither of them could quite fill. And yet, as she watched James stand at the barn one evening, his face softened in the light of the setting sun, Catherine felt something shift between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something that had been growing slowly between them. The quiet understanding, the companionship, the shared grief that they both carried. And for the first time since arriving, Catherine allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this new life could offer them more than just survival. Maybe it could offer them something they had both lost, a chance at healing, a chance at belonging, a chance at family. As December settled over the land like a heavy blanket, the stark cold of Montana's winter seemed to seep into every crevice of the house. Yet inside Copper Creek Ranch, a quiet warmth began to take root. The days were shorter, the nights longer, and the wind howled relentlessly outside. But there was something different about this winter, something that felt less like survival and more like living. For the first time in months, Catherine could hear her children laughing without fear, their voices echoing through the halls, filling the spaces that had once been empty. They were adjusting to this new life, to the rhythm of ranch life, to the steady presence of James. James, for his part, had become an unexpected part of the family's routine. His hard edges, once sharp and unyielding, had softened bit by bit as he worked alongside Catherine and her children. Every day, he taught Thomas more about ranching, showing him how to mend fences, care for the animals, and keep the ranch running smoothly. There were small moments between them, like when Thomas asked him about his past, or when James praised him for a job well done. It was a silent bond, built on shared work and unspoken understanding. The younger children had begun to view him with a trust that had once seemed impossible. They would run to him with drawings, gifts of wildflowers they had picked, and even the occasional shy smile. And though James still retreated into his own solitude each evening, Catherine noticed the subtle shifts in him, the small acts of kindness, the unspoken affection in his eyes when he watched the children play, the quiet way he began to care for them as though they were his own. Catherine's role had changed, too. She had always been the one to care for others, to put their needs before her own. But here, in this quiet corner of Montana, she had begun to reclaim pieces of herself she had long forgotten. She took pride in the warmth of the house, in the way the children's laughter filled the rooms, in the way the barn and the fields were slowly becoming more than just a place of work. She had never been a woman to let her heart open easily, but here, she found herself allowing the warmth of her family to fill the cracks in her heart. Christmas, however, loomed on the horizon like an unspoken challenge. The children had heard rumors, had asked Catherine what they could expect, but she had no answers. James had made it clear from the beginning that Christmas was not something he celebrated. It was a painful reminder of everything he had lost. Sarah, his wife, had died just days before Christmas 8 years ago, and their infant son had died on Christmas Eve. James had buried them both during a brutal snowstorm, and since that day, Christmas had become a day of silence, a day he would rather forget. Catherine knew this. She had seen the sorrow in his eyes when he spoke of the past, the pain that never quite went away. And so, when the children began to ask about Christmas, she didn't have the heart to tell them the truth. She told them simply, "We'll see what happens." But as the days passed and the children grew more excited, she knew that something had to change. She could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken question hanging between her and James. Christmas was coming, and they would have to decide whether to face it together or let it pull them apart. One afternoon, as Catherine walked behind the barn, she stumbled upon 2 graves, simple stones, barely marked by time. One was for Sarah Cartwright, James's wife, and the other was for their infant son. Catherine stood still for a long moment, feeling the weight of the history that lay in front of her. The cold, hard ground beneath her feet seemed to mirror the weight of grief that had settled over James. She kneeled down, brushing the snow off the stones, and whispered softly, "Mrs. Cartwright, I hope you don't mind us being here. Your husband saved my children. He's a good man, but he's locked in grief. I think you'd want him to live again." She placed a small wreath made of pine boughs on each grave, a simple gesture of respect. As she stood up, she turned to see James standing a few paces behind her, his face unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, James walked toward her and looked down at the graves, his breath coming out in clouds. "You're not intruding," he said softly. "First flowers they've had in years." Catherine nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the moment. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know if anything could ease the pain that James had carried with him for so long. But she knew that the grief, though it would never go away, could no longer define him. "You're doing better than you think," Catherine whispered, her voice thick with emotion. James looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw something like hope in his eyes. "Maybe," he said quietly, "maybe I am." As Christmas drew closer, Catherine found herself quietly preparing for the holiday, despite James's resistance. She knew he wouldn't want to celebrate, but she also knew that the children needed something to hold on to, something to believe in. She began to gather the ingredients for a simple Christmas meal, baking cookies, preparing the small tree they had cut down from the forest, and making decorations with the children. Emma and Margaret helped her make paper chains, while the younger children worked on painting wooden ornaments. It was nothing grand, nothing extravagant, but it was a small act of defiance against the grief that had settled in the house. On Christmas Eve, Catherine sat with the children around the fireplace, telling them stories of Christmases long past, of the joy and laughter that had once filled her own home. The children were wide-eyed, their imaginations alive with the possibility of magic, of hope. They had never seen a Christmas like this, and for the first time in months, Catherine allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could create something beautiful here, something that didn't have to be defined by loss. Later that night, James entered the house, his boots heavy on the wooden floors. He had been in the barn, as he often was, tried to escape the festivities, tried to avoid the feelings that Christmas always stirred in him. But tonight, something was different. He looked at Catherine and the children, all of them gathered together, the warmth of the fire casting soft light on their faces. The laughter, the joy, the quiet hum of life. It filled the room in a way that he hadn't known in years. He could see it in their eyes, their hope, their belief that this Christmas could be something more than just a reminder of loss. And for the first time, James allowed himself to let go of the grief that had weighed him down for so long. He didn't know how it happened, didn't know when the walls had started to come down, but he found himself walking over to the table where the children were sitting, their faces lit up with excitement. I don't celebrate Christmas," he began, his voice rough, as though the words were foreign to him. "But I've been thinking, maybe it's time." The children looked at him, wide-eyed, as though they couldn't believe what they were hearing. James's voice softened. Sarah loved Christmas. It was her favorite time of year. She baked for days, decorated everything, sang carols. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to celebrate it. It felt like I'd be forgetting her, like it would somehow dishonor her memory. He paused, his gaze flickering toward the graves outside. But maybe, just maybe, celebrating would honor her memory, show that her love didn't die with her. Catherine stood, her heart swelling with emotion as she took a step toward him. "You don't have to do this alone, James," she said softly. "We'll do it together." The words were simple, but they held a weight that neither of them could deny. For the first time in a long while, James felt something stir in him, a warmth, a flicker of hope, something he had thought he'd lost forever. "If we do this Christmas, I'll need help," he said, his voice thick. I don't remember how to celebrate. I don't remember how to make it special." Catherine smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "We'll remember together," she said softly. And so they did. Together, they decorated the tree, they baked cookies, they sang carols by the fire, and they made new memories. James joined them at the table, and for the first time in years, he found himself truly celebrating Christmas. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't free from pain, but it was enough. As the night wore on, and the children went to bed, exhausted from the joy of the day, James and Catherine stood together by the fire, the warmth of the house surrounding them. "Thank you," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "for pushing me, for making me remember what Christmas is supposed to be." Catherine reached out, touching his hand. "You did it yourself, James," she said softly. "You allowed yourself to heal." And as the fire crackled and the world outside grew quiet, Catherine realized that they had both found something in each other, a way to heal, to move forward, and to build something new. Something that could carry them through the hardest days, something that could withstand the weight of the past. They had found love. They had found family. And in that, they had found healing. January arrived with a biting wind that seemed to cut deeper into the bones than any of the cold before. The nights were longer now, and as snow piled up around Copper Creek Ranch, Catherine and the children found themselves increasingly reliant on the warmth of the house. The ranch had become their sanctuary, a place where they could, for once, stop running from the cold and the world outside. James had worked tirelessly alongside the children, teaching them the ways of the ranch, how to break in a horse, how to mend the fences, how to live off the land that surrounded them. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of the work seemed overwhelming, but they did it together. For the first time in a long while, they felt like a family. Catherine had noticed the small changes in James, his quiet smiles when the children did something right, the way he had begun to join them for meals without retreating afterward into the solitude of the barn. Even Emma had noticed it, and one evening after supper, she asked Catherine in a hushed voice, "Do you think we could stay here, Ma? Past spring, I mean." Catherine had looked at her daughter, her heart heavy with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "We'll see, darling," she had said, her voice soft. "We'll see." She had wanted to give Emma a definitive answer, but the truth was she didn't know what the future would hold. There was too much uncertainty in the air, too many unknowns. James's past still lingered over them, and as much as they had begun to heal, there were wounds too deep to be ignored. But despite her uncertainty, Catherine couldn't help but feel that something had changed between her and James. It was subtle, but it was there. They had moved beyond just being employer and employee. There was a quiet respect, an unspoken understanding between them that had begun to grow into something more. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a beginning. However, that fragile peace was about to be shattered. One late afternoon, as James and Thomas were repairing a fence along the east side of the property, Catherine heard the sound of a wagon approaching. She stood at the window, watching as it came into view, a large, imposing wagon drawn by two sturdy horses, kicking up the snow behind them. The wagon came to a stop near the house, and Catherine's stomach tightened in warning. The man who stepped out was tall, dressed in black, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything with a cold precision. He was a stranger to her, and something about him set her on edge. She couldn't quite place it, but there was an aura about him that screamed trouble. He walked with purpose, his boots crunching in the snow as he made his way toward the front door. Before Catherine could say anything, the door was knocked on firmly. She opened it cautiously, only to be met by the man's calculating stare. "I'm looking for Catherine Brennan," he said, his voice low and clipped. Catherine's heart sank. "I'm Catherine Brennan," she said, her voice firm, though her mind raced. "What do you want?" The man's gaze flickered briefly to the children who were gathered behind her, their faces curious but fearful. "I'm Vincent Drury," the man said, his lips curving into a cold smile. "I'm here on business. I represent First Kansas Bank. The name sent a chill through Catherine's spine. She knew what that meant. Your late husband, Marcus Brennan, owed the bank $500. Drury continued, his voice calculating. I'm here to collect. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. $500. The debt had been hanging over her for months now, and she knew that if it wasn't paid, there would be consequences. But she had no way of paying it. No money. No prospects. She had nothing left to give. I have nothing, Catherine said quietly, the words barely escaping her lips. My husband left me with debts. He died 3 months ago, and I've been struggling to survive ever since. Drury looked her over with a sneer. Then you have nothing to offer, but you have something valuable. Your children. Catherine's blood ran cold as she stared at him, trying to process his words. I'm authorized to claim assets, Drury continued, his eyes gleaming with cold determination. If you cannot pay, I'll take what you owe in labor. Your children. 7 years each should cover it. The words felt like a slap in the face. She couldn't breathe. You can't take my children, she shouted, her voice rising in anger and fear. They're not for sale. Drury's expression remained unchanged, as though her outrage meant nothing to him. It's legal, ma'am, he said coldly. You don't have a choice. Either you pay the debt, or you let your children work it off. It's that simple. Catherine backed away from the door, her heart racing. Her mind was spinning with the horror of what he was saying. She had nothing left to give, and now he was threatening to take her children. It was more than she could bear. Please, she whispered, almost to herself. Please don't take my children. At that moment, James appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling the entrance. His presence seemed to fill the space, a silent protection, an unspoken promise. What's going on here? James asked, his voice steady, but Catherine could see the tension in his jaw. Drury looked him over briefly, then smirked. This is none of your concern, Cartwright, he said dismissively. I'm here to collect a debt. James's eyes narrowed, and he stepped forward, planting himself between Catherine and Drury. This is my home, he said firmly. You have no right to be here. Drury's eyes flickered with irritation, but he stood his ground. Are you her husband? He asked, his tone mocking. James didn't flinch. No, he said simply, his voice low and unyielding. Then step aside, Drury ordered. You have no legal standing here. James remained unmoved, his body tense, but his voice calm. How much do you say she owes? Drury hesitated for a moment, then answered, $500 plus interest. A total of $650. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Catherine could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she knew that James wasn't about to let them take the children. I'll pay it, James said, his voice unwavering. The room fell silent. Catherine looked at him in shock, her mind racing. James, that's your entire savings, she whispered. You don't have to do this. You don't owe me anything. James didn't look at her. He walked toward the study without a word, returning moments later with a leather pouch filled with gold coins. He placed the exact amount on the table, the sound of the coins hitting the wood like a final blow. Drury smiled smugly, counting the coins with slow deliberation. Once he was satisfied, he signed the release papers with a flourish. Pleasure doing business, he said coldly. The debt is satisfied. With that, he turned and left the house, disappearing into the snowy night. Catherine stood frozen, her mind still reeling from what had just happened. She had no words to express the gratitude, the disbelief, the emotions that surged through her. Her children gathered around her, confused and frightened by the sudden tension. Why did he do that? Thomas asked, his young voice trembling. Why did he give that man all his money? Catherine couldn't answer him. She turned to James, who stood near the door, his back turned to them. Why? She asked, her voice breaking. Why would you do that? Why would you give up everything for us? James's face was hard, but his eyes were filled with something she couldn't quite read. He took a deep breath, his voice thick with emotion. Because they're not taking you. Not while I'm breathing. Not while I can do something about it. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. I can never repay you for this, she whispered. I don't even know what to say. James shook his head, his voice tight. You don't owe me anything. I'm asking for nothing in return. He turned toward the door, but before he left, he looked back at her. I'm asking for something else. I'm asking you to stay. Not for a season. Forever. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process the feelings that were rising in her chest. She had never imagined that someone could offer her this kind of security, this kind of protection. She had never thought that anyone could care for her the way James had. The tears that had been building for so long finally fell. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll stay. James didn't say anything more. He simply walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. As Catherine stood in the quiet house, her heart heavy but full of something new, something unexpected, she knew that this moment had changed everything. James had declared his intentions, not just with his actions, but with his heart. And for the first time in a long while, Catherine allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could have the family they'd lost and the future they'd always dreamed of. But even as the words of their shared promise echoed in her mind, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring yet another test, one that would define them, once and for all. The days after the incident with Vincent Drury passed in a blur of relief and tension, each one marking a slow return to normalcy that Catherine hadn't thought was possible. The children, though still shaken by the visit from the collection agent, were now secure, their future uncertain only in the way all futures were. But for the first time, they were allowed to feel the joy of being children again. They played in the snow outside the house, their laughter echoing through the crisp air, their worries forgotten for the moment. Catherine, too, allowed herself to breathe a little easier. James's actions had secured their safety, but it was more than just the money. His promise to stand by them, to offer them a future in this home, had softened the edges of her uncertainty, had given her something to hold on to in a world that had so often taken from her. Despite everything, despite the years of grief that weighed on both of them, Catherine began to see something in James that she hadn't expected: tenderness. It wasn't loud or boisterous, not the kind of affection she had known in the past, but a quiet, steady presence that had a way of creeping into the small moments between them. They had not yet spoken of the future, not fully, not in terms of what it meant for them as a family. But Catherine knew that the way James cared for her children, the way he silently acknowledged their presence and protected them, meant something. It meant everything. In the days leading up to Christmas, James began to change in ways that were subtle but undeniable. He no longer avoided the table after supper, no longer retreated to the barn alone. He spent more time with the children, teaching them the skills they needed to run the ranch, helping them with tasks they had never imagined themselves capable of. The house, once cold and barren, was now filled with the sounds of life. The crackling of the fire, the clinking of utensils at the dinner table, the laughter and chatter of the children as they worked side by side with him. There was an ease between them now, an understanding that had taken root in their shared work, their shared grief, and perhaps, in time, something more. On the morning of Christmas Eve, Catherine woke early, the sun barely a whisper on the horizon, and made her way to the barn. She had been thinking about the promise James had made to them, the promise that they could have Christmas, and she had something in mind. The children had decorated the tree, and she had baked pies, cookies, and a simple Christmas bread. She had planned for the day to be small, but full of meaning, and now, as she stood in the dim light of the barn, she could see James's workshop, the small space where he had been carving something over the past few weeks. She had seen the blocks of wood he had worked on, noticed the quiet way he had spent time in the barn, alone. She approached him carefully, not wanting to startle him. He was hunched over a workbench, carving small figures. He didn't look up when she entered, but she could see the gentle way his hands moved, the care he took with each piece of wood. "James?" she asked softly, her voice carrying through the quiet space. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers with an unreadable expression. "What are you doing?" she asked, her heart pounding in her chest as she realized what he was making. "Just a few things for the kids," he said gruffly, wiping the wood shavings from his hands. "Toys. Something to put under the tree." Catherine's heart swelled. She stepped closer, watching him work for a moment before speaking again. "You're giving them more than toys, James. You're giving them memories. You're giving them something to hold on to." James didn't say anything for a long moment. He looked down at the wooden figures, his expression unreadable, then finally nodded. They deserve something more than just surviving, something more than just getting by. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. She hadn't realized how much she had needed to hear that, how much she had needed to hear him say that he cared, that he was giving them more than shelter, more than protection. He was giving them a future. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We're all giving something," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We're all giving a little bit of ourselves." James looked at her then, his expression softening. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. "How to be a father, how to be part of a family again." Catherine reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. "You're already doing it, James. You're already doing it." The warmth in his gaze seemed to melt something in her chest, a quiet understanding that had grown between them over time, an unspoken promise that maybe, just maybe, they were starting to heal. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity, decorating the house, preparing the meal, setting the table, and finally, after the children were tucked into bed, the quiet moments between her and James. For the first time, there was no distance between them. He didn't retreat to the barn. He stayed with her by the fire, talking quietly about the past, about his memories of Sarah, about the life they had built together and the life he thought he had lost forever. It wasn't a confession, not exactly, but it was a breakthrough. He had allowed her to see the man behind the walls he had built around himself. As midnight approached, Catherine stood at the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, the stars shining brightly above. It felt like a different world, one where hope could grow even in the harshest of winters. She turned back to the room, her gaze landing on James, who stood by the fire, his eyes on her. "I thought we weren't doing Christmas," she said softly, a teasing smile playing on her lips. James met her gaze, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I said I didn't celebrate it," he said, "but I never said we couldn't." He stepped forward, taking her hand in his touch gentle, almost reverent. "Catherine, I want to do this with you. For the kids. For us." She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "James, are you sure? About all of this?" He nodded, his expression steady. "I'm sure," he said softly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The words, so simple, so honest, settled in her heart. And in that moment, she realized that everything they had been through, every hardship, every heartache, had led them here to this moment. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living, and they were doing it together. The next day, Christmas morning, the house was filled with the sound of children's laughter as they opened their gifts. Wooden toys, dolls, and small trinkets that James had carved with his own hands. They were simple things, but to the children, they were treasures, symbols of the love and care that had gone into them. It wasn't the extravagant holiday they had once known, but it was a celebration nonetheless. A celebration of family, a celebration of life. As they sat around the table for Christmas dinner, the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth, Catherine looked around at her children, at James, at the house that had become their home, and felt a profound sense of peace settle in her heart. For the first time in years, she felt like she had everything she needed. She had a family, she had love, and she had a future. James, sitting across from her, caught her gaze and smiled. A real smile, not the guarded, distant expression he had worn before, but one filled with warmth and hope. "We've made it," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Catherine nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "We've made it," she whispered back. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. They had built something beautiful, something lasting, something that couldn't be torn apart by the past or the trials they had faced. They had built a family, and that was all that mattered. As the day wore on, and the children played with their new toys, Catherine and James stood outside for a moment, the snow falling softly around them. The cold didn't seem so harsh now. The future didn't seem so uncertain. They were no longer just two broken people. They were a family, and that was enough. James turned to her, his hand reaching for hers. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go inside. We've got a family to take care of." Catherine smiled, her heart full, and together they walked back to the warmth of their home, ready to face whatever the future might bring, hand in hand. Forever.